The HOA demolished my lake cabin right after I said I was moving out. They bulldozed it, turned the one place my late wife ever found peace into nothing but dust and splinters. The HOA president stood there, smiling, calling it a safety hazard. But this wasn't about rules. This was pure revenge for escaping her control. She thought she had broken me, but she made one fatal mistake. While she was busy tearing down my past, she had no idea that her entire little kingdom was built on land I was secretly buying up. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, because you're about to see a takedown for the ages. And if you believe no petty tyrant with a clipboard should ever get away with this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment her entire fake empire comes crashing down. That last summer was quiet. The kind of quiet you can only find by a lake at dawn, when the water is glass and the only sound is a loon calling from across the cove. I'd built that cabin with my own 2 hands, log by log, right after I got out of the service. It wasn't much, just one big room with a stone fireplace and a wide porch overlooking the water. But it was mine. More than mine, it was ours. It was the last place my wife, Sarah, felt truly at peace before the cancer took her. I could still see her sitting on that porch swing, a blanket over her lap, just watching the sun go down. The cabin wasn't just wood and nails. It was a testament, a monument to a life well lived, a promise I'd kept. It sat on a piece of land my granddad bought, separate from the ticky-tacky subdivision that had sprung up a quarter mile down the road. But my main house, the one I lived in day to day, was stuck inside that subdivision, inside the grip of the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. And the HOA was run by Linda Crawford. Linda was a woman who discovered the only power she'd ever have in life was hidden in the fine print of a 3-ring binder, and she wielded it like a queen commanding her armies. She was in her 50s, with a haircut so sharp it looked like it could cut you, and a permanent look of disappointment on her face. Her favorite pastime was cruising the neighborhood in her golf cart, a clipboard resting on the passenger seat, hunting for infractions. Grass a quarter inch too high? That's a $25 fine. Garbage can out 10 minutes past the designated time? $50. She fined my neighbor Tommy Hayes once because the American flag he flew from his porch had, in her words, suffered minor sun fading. The woman derived a sick pleasure from ruining someone's day. For years, I'd just paid the stupid fines and kept my head down. My main house was just a place to sleep. The cabin was where I lived. But with Sarah gone, the big house felt empty, and Linda's constant nagging felt more like a grinding stone than a simple annoyance. The decision to sell came easy. I was done. Done with the endless rules, the passive-aggressive newsletters, the feeling of being watched. I was going to sell the house in the subdivision, move into the cabin full-time, and finally breathe free. I'd hired a realtor, started packing boxes, and was clearing out the garage when Linda's golf cart came humming up my driveway. She didn't get out, just sat there peering over her sunglasses like a hawk spotting a field mouse. "Heard you're leaving us, Jack," she said. Her voice was syrupy sweet, the kind that always came before the sting. I kept hauling a box of old tools to my truck, not giving her the satisfaction of stopping. "That's the plan, Linda. Closing in a few weeks. Finally getting out from under the thumb." I gave her a wide, honest-to-God smile, the first one she'd probably seen from me in years. It felt good. It felt like victory. Her own smile, thin and painted on, didn't just fade. It evaporated. Her face hardened, and for a second, I saw something truly nasty in her eyes. It wasn't just disappointment. It was anger, like I had personally insulted her. "You can't just walk away from your obligations, Jack," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "You signed the covenants. You're still under our rules until the day that house is no longer in your name." I just laughed. I couldn't help it. "What are you going to do, Linda? Fine an empty house? Send violation notices to the new owners? It's their problem in a few weeks." My cabin isn't even in your jurisdiction." I motioned with my head toward the lake, where my own slice of heaven sat untouchable. Or so I thought. Her eyes followed my gesture, and a strange, cold look passed over her face. She adjusted her sunglasses, the moment of raw anger disappearing behind her usual mask of smug authority. "We'll see about that," she chirped, the sweetness back in her voice. She put the cart in reverse and hummed away, leaving me standing in my driveway. I shook my head and went back to my work. A part of me knew she was planning something, but I figured it would be another bogus fine, some paperwork nightmare to make the closing a headache. I was a practical man. I understood contracts, property lines, and the law. What I didn't understand was the bottomless spite of a petty tyrant who was about to lose one of her subjects. I figured once I signed those closing papers, I was free. I had no idea that to Linda this wasn't about rules. It was about her losing control. And she was about to show me that she'd rather burn my world to the ground than let me walk away happy. The closing on the house was a quiet affair. Just a lot of papers to sign and a handshake with the new owners. A young couple excited to start a family. I handed them the keys, wished them well, and felt a weight lift off my shoulders I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Freedom. It tasted like the stale coffee in the realtor's office, but it was freedom nonetheless. I drove away from that subdivision for the last time, not even glancing in the rearview mirror. My truck was pointed toward the lake, toward the cabin, toward the first day of the rest of my life. I had a few weeks of contract work lined up in the next county over, a simple wiring job that would pay well. My plan was to get it done, then come back and spend the rest of the autumn fishing, fixing the leaky gutter on the cabin, and finally, just being still. For 3 weeks, that's exactly what I did. I worked hard, slept in a cheap motel, and thought about the future. I called my daughter Maggie a couple of times. She was relieved I'd finally sold the house and was getting away from Linda. "Just be careful, Dad," she'd said. "That woman's a snake." I told her not to worry. The snake was defanged. I was out of her terrarium. When I finally turned onto the long gravel road that led to my property, I was smiling. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the pine trees. I rolled the windows down and breathed in the smell of damp earth and pine needles. Home. I could already picture it, cracking open a cold beer on the porch, watching the water. I rounded the final bend in the road, my eyes fixed on the spot where the cabin's roof should have been visible through the trees. But it wasn't there. There was just sky. My foot eased off the gas. Maybe I was looking at the wrong angle. Maybe a tree had fallen and was blocking the view. My heart started a low, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I parked the truck and got out. The silence was wrong. It was too empty. There was no smoke curling from the chimney. No warm light in the windows. There were no windows. There was no cabin. I walked into the clearing, and my legs almost gave out from under me. It was gone. Not burned down, not collapsed. It was demolished, leveled. A bulldozer had been through, its heavy tracks still gouged into the soft earth. My beautiful cabin, the one I built with my own hands, was now a pile of splintered logs and shattered glass, pushed unceremoniously to the side of the clearing like a heap of garbage. The stone fireplace, the heart of the home, was a jagged ruin. A single piece of the porch swing's chain lay half buried in the mud. I knelt down and picked it up, the cold metal biting into my palm. Sarah's swing, the place she'd spent her final summer. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to brace myself against a tree. This wasn't a mistake. This was an execution, and I knew exactly who had signed the order. Pinned to the very same tree I was leaning on was a laminated notice from the Lakeside Meadows HOA. It was a formal declaration of demolition, citing multiple violations of community aesthetic standards and a severe safety hazard due to structural instability. The document was signed at the bottom in a crisp, smug signature. Linda Crawford, President. My first call was to the county sheriff. A deputy came out, looked at the wreckage, read the notice, and gave me a shrug. Looks like a civil matter, sir. It's on your property, but they're claiming you were in violation. You'll have to take it up with the HOA board. My hands were shaking, a cold rage building in my chest. I stormed over to the community clubhouse that evening, where the board was having one of their monthly meetings. I walked in without knocking. Linda was at the head of the table, flanked by her two loyal cronies, Karen Fields and a retired cop named Mark Graves, who they kept on retainer as security. Linda looked up, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes before it was replaced by a mask of cold authority. "Jack, this is a private meeting," she said, her voice like ice. "My cabin is a pile of splinters, Linda." "You had no right," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. She gave a little sigh, a theatrical display of patience. "We sent you multiple warnings about the state of that structure. It was an eyesore and a liability." The board voted unanimously. It was for the good of the community. She slid a folder across the table. It was full of grainy photos of my cabin, with red circles drawn around peeling paint on a window frame, and a patch of moss on the roof. The warnings were letters I'd never received, conveniently sent after I had already left for my job out of town. It was all a sham, a lie built on a foundation of pure malice. Then came the sucker punch. And then there's the matter of the demolition costs and the associated fines for non-compliance. She continued, pulling out another sheet of paper. It was an invoice for an amount that made my blood run cold. They weren't just content with destroying my property, they wanted me to pay for it. They were threatening to put a lien on my land, the one thing I had left. The neighbors who had gathered outside the clubhouse, drawn by the commotion, just whispered amongst themselves. A few shot me sympathetic glances, but no one spoke up. They were afraid. Linda had them all on a leash. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and I saw her for what she was, a petty, miserable person whose only joy came from the suffering of others. She thought she had won. She thought she had broken me, buried me under a pile of rubble and bogus fines. I turned and walked out of that room without another word. I walked back to my land, back to the cleared patch of dirt where my life used to be. The sun had set, and a cold wind was blowing off the lake. I stood there in the dark, the rusty chain of Sarah's swing still clenched in my fist. The world I had known was gone. The peace I had sought was shattered. But as the grief and shock began to recede, something else took their place. A fire. A cold, hard certainty that settled deep in my bones. Linda Crawford had made a fatal miscalculation. She thought she was tearing down an old cabin. What she had really done was awaken a part of me that I had buried a long time ago. She had declared war. And in a war, you don't play by the enemy's rules. You make your own. Grief is a heavy fog, but rage is a burning signal fire. For the first few days after the demolition, I did nothing. I just sat on the tailgate of my truck, staring at the pile of wood that used to be my life, the cold lake air doing nothing to cool the furnace in my gut. On the third day, a familiar pickup truck rumbled down my gravel drive. It was Tommy Hayes. He got out, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee, and didn't say a word. He just handed one to me, leaned against my truck, and stared at the wreckage with me. Tommy was a good man, a handyman who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years and had the HOA scars to prove it. We sat in silence for a long time before he finally spoke. "She fined me $100 last year," he said, his voice a low growl. "Said the oil stain on my driveway was an environmental hazard. My truck's 25 years old. It's not leaking oil, it's marking its territory." I managed a small, bitter laugh. "She told me my American flag was sun-faded," I said. He nodded. "Heard about that. Linda's got a special kind of sickness." He took a sip of his coffee. "You're not the only one she's done this to, Jack. Not this bad, maybe, but she's been bleeding people dry for years. Most folks are too scared to say anything. They've got mortgages, kids in school. They can't afford a war." He looked me straight in the eye. But you can. You've got nothing left to lose right here. And whatever you decide to do, I've got your back. That was the spark. That night, Tommy and I sat in his garage and made a list. We kept it small, just a handful of people we knew we could trust. There was Mrs. Gable, a widow in her 70s, who Linda was trying to fine into oblivion over a bird feeder she claimed attracted undesirable wildlife. There was the Rodriguez family, who'd been ordered to tear down their kid's wooden swing set because it wasn't on the HOA's pre-approved list of playground equipment. One by one, we met with them, not in a group, but quietly, in their backyards or over their kitchen tables. We didn't promise victory, we just offered a chance to stand together. Fear is a powerful chain, but the sight of a neighbor willing to help you break it is even more powerful. Our little rebellion was born. And of course, Linda heard about it. Her network of spies was legendary. Her retaliation was swift and stupidly predictable. A notice appeared on Tommy's door, then Mrs. Gable's, then the Rodriguez's. It was a mandatory home safety inspection scheduled for the following Saturday. Linda's pet enforcer, Karen Fields, would be accompanying a certified inspector to check for electrical and structural hazards. It was a transparent power play, a fishing expedition to find more things to find them for. On Saturday morning, I was sitting on Tommy's porch when Karen Fields strutted up the driveway, clipboard in hand, with a nervous-looking man in a polo shirt trailing behind her. "We're here for the scheduled inspection," Karen announced, unable to keep the glee out of her voice. I stood up slowly. "Morning, Karen," I said calmly. "Who's your friend?" The man stepped forward. "I'm the inspector," he mumbled. I looked at the logo on his shirt. "You work for a home appraisal company," I stated, not as a question. "Are you a licensed master electrician certified by the state to conduct residential electrical safety audits?" The man blinked, thrown off. "Well, no, Then you have no legal authority to inspect his wiring," I said, my voice flat and even. "And as for structural integrity, unless you're a state-licensed civil engineer, your opinion on his foundation is just that, an opinion. Tommy is declining your offer for a friendly chat. You are on private property. You have 60 seconds to be back on the sidewalk." Karen's face went purple. She sputtered something about HOA bylaws, but I just held my ground, unblinking. The inspector looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. He turned and practically ran back to his car. Karen, defeated and humiliated, had no choice but to follow. A few neighbors who had been watching from their windows saw the whole thing. It was a small win, a tiny crack in Linda's fortress, but it was a start. It showed them she wasn't invincible. Linda's response was to double down on the one thing she was good at: bureaucracy. Suddenly, there were emergency board meetings called for absurd reasons, an hour-long debate on the approved shade of beige for mailbox posts, a 90-minute session to discuss the optimal length of decorative lawn grass. They were held on weeknights, designed to wear us down, to make fighting back an exhausting, soul-crushing chore. But we showed up to every single one. We sat in the back, silent, a constant nagging reminder that we weren't going away. It was during one of these pointless meetings, listening to Linda drone on about the evils of garden gnomes, that I realized we were playing the wrong game. We were fighting on her turf, by her rules. That had to change. The next morning, I drove down to the county records office. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just had a hunch. For hours, I sat in that dusty basement, poring over old plat maps and property deeds, tracing the history of this land back to the 1970s when the subdivision was first planned. And then I found it. It wasn't a bombshell. It was a tiny overlooked detail, a faded signature missing on an old easement agreement from 40 years ago. An agreement that granted the HOA its authority over the communal lakefront path, the very path they used to access and condemn my cabin. Their entire legal right to be on that side of the lake was based on a piece of paper that was never officially finalized. All these years, their power, their fines, their reign of terror, it was all built on a shaky, forgotten legal bluff. I rolled up the map, a cold, methodical plan, already taking shape in my mind. Linda thought this was a battle of fines and bylaws. I was about to turn it into a battle for the land itself. Finding that dusty old map felt like finding a key in a prison cell. It wasn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. Not yet. But it was a key. For 40 years, the HOA's power over the entire lakefront, the source of their authority to fine people for leaving a canoe on the shore, or, in my case, to level a man's home, was built on a legal handshake that was never completed. A forgotten signature. Linda, in her obsessive quest to master every comma in the current bylaws, had never bothered to check if the foundation of her little kingdom was made of stone or sand. And it was sand. All of it. I drove home that day with a new kind of calm. The hot, blinding rage had cooled into something harder and heavier, like steel. I wasn't going to sue them. A lawsuit would take years, cost a fortune in lawyer fees, and give Linda exactly what she wanted: a public stage to play the victim. No, I wasn't going to fight her in a courtroom. I was going to buy the courtroom. The plan was simple in concept, but insane in execution. If the HOA's claim to the land was weak, then the person who owned the land held all the cards. I wasn't just going to buy one lot, I was going to buy it all. The vast, undeveloped tracts of woods that surrounded the Lakeside Meadows subdivision, the empty parcels, the forgotten corners of the county that bordered our community, I was going to acquire them, piece by agonizing piece, until I effectively drew a new border around their entire world, a border they couldn't cross without my permission. I started quietly. I cashed out a portion of my retirement savings, the nest egg Sarah and I had built for a future we never got to have. It felt wrong, but it also felt necessary. Justice had a price, and I was willing to pay it. My first move was to hire a lawyer, a quiet, no-nonsense guy from the city who specialized in real estate and didn't know Linda Crawford from a hole in the ground. He set up a shell company for me, an LLC with a name so boring it was practically invisible: Pine Ridge Holdings. From that point on, Jack Reynolds, retired electrician, ceased to exist in the world of property transactions. Pine Ridge Holdings did all the buying. My old life in the trades gave me an advantage Linda could never understand. I knew people. I knew the surveyors who had mapped this area for decades. I knew the contractors who knew which aging landowners were tired of paying taxes on woods they never walked in. My veteran savvy taught me patience and strategy. I didn't go for the obvious properties first. I started with a landlocked parcel deep in the woods, then a small strip along the far highway. Each purchase was a small, seemingly random piece of a puzzle that only I could see. I called in favors, traded electrical work for information, and spent my evenings poring over county tax maps, cross-referencing deeds, and identifying the next target. My little team of allies, Tommy, Mrs. Gable, knew something was up, but I kept the full scope of the plan to myself. The fewer people who knew, the safer it was. My only outside confirmation came from a civil engineer Tommy knew, a tough old bird named Dave, who looked at my copy of the faulty easement map for about 10 seconds. He just grunted. "Yep, they have no standing," he said, tapping the map with a thick finger. "Their claim to that lake path is based on this document. This document isn't legally binding. Whoever owns the land underneath that path controls the path. Period." My life became a quiet obsession. I was living out of a small apartment I'd rented in the next town over, and my days were a blur of phone calls, bank transfers, and quiet meetings in coffee shops. The money from my house sale drained away, followed by my savings. It was a terrifying gamble. The weight of it all started to show. My daughter Maggie came to visit me one Sunday. She took one look at the maps, spread all over my kitchen table and the dark circles under my eyes, and her face fell. "Dad, what is all this?" she asked, her voice soft with worry. I tried to explain, tried to show her the flaw in the HOA's foundation, the genius of the plan. She just shook her head. "You're spending everything. Mom's life insurance, your retirement. For what? To get back at some miserable woman in a golf cart? Dad, this isn't going to bring the cabin back. It's not going to bring Mom back." Her words hit me harder than Linda's bulldozer. She was right. The cabin was gone forever. Sarah was gone forever. For a heavy moment, the whole plan felt like a fool's errand, a crazy old man's desperate attempt to punch a hole in the ocean. I saw myself through her eyes, a man obsessed, pouring his last years and his last dollars into a fire fueled by pure spite. Doubt, cold and heavy, settled in my stomach. Maybe I should just stop. Maybe I should just walk away, leave the state, and let Linda have her rotten little kingdom. Maggie hugged me, her grip tight. "I just don't want to lose you too," she whispered. That night, I almost gave up. I sat alone in the dark, staring at the numbers in my bank account getting smaller and smaller. But then I thought of Sarah on that porch swing. I thought of Tommy's flag, and the Rodriguez's swing set, and Mrs. Gable's bird feeder. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about the principle. It was about drawing a line and telling people like Linda that they do not get to have that kind of power over other people's lives. This wasn't just revenge. It was a restoration. The next morning, I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. "There's a 20-acre parcel just south of the lake," I said, my voice steady again. "Let's make an offer." The fire was back. My quiet war of acquisition couldn't stay quiet forever. While I was operating through a faceless LLC, the sheer number of "for sale" signs that went up and came down around the neighborhood in a matter of months was bound to create whispers. People started noticing. I was careful, never showing my face at any closing, never making a call from a local number. But Linda wasn't stupid. She was paranoid, which is a close cousin to observant. She didn't know what was happening, but she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. And when a cornered animal feels threatened, it lashes out. She chose her moment perfectly. It was a regular quarterly HOA meeting, but she'd sent out a special notice promising a critical update on community security. That little bit of fear-mongering packed the room. I almost didn't go, but Tommy insisted. "You gotta be there," he'd said. "Whatever she's planning, you need to see it with your own eyes." So I went. I took a seat in the back row, same as always. The first hour was the usual garbage. Linda droning on about budgets and the new rules regarding holiday lawn ornaments. Then, she paused, took a sip of water, and scanned the room, her eyes landing on me for just a second. "And that brings me to the topic of community security," she began, her voice taking on a somber, theatrical tone. "As some of you may have noticed, there have been several instances of vandalism lately. The fence near the community garden was tampered with. We had a report of an unauthorized vehicle parked on the access road overnight. Small things, perhaps, but they are symptoms of a larger problem." She let the silence hang in the air. "It seems that since certain individuals have decided they are above our community's rules, they feel empowered to engage in a campaign of intimidation and destruction." Her gaze locked onto mine. "Jack, we all know you're upset about the necessary removal of your dilapidated structure, but this vendetta has to stop." A murmur went through the room. My head snapped up. I couldn't believe the audacity. I hadn't been near the community garden in 5 years. "What are you talking about, Linda?" I asked, my voice coming out louder than I intended. She gave a sad little shake of her head, a practiced look of weary disappointment. "We have a witness who saw your truck near the access road last week, late at night. The same night the lock on the gate was jimmied. And you've been seen talking to a number of residents, spreading lies and misinformation about this board, trying to turn neighbors against one another. This was brilliant, in a sick, twisted way. She was taking my quiet conversations with Tommy and Mrs. Gable and painting them as a conspiracy. She was turning my righteous anger into petty vandalism. "That's a lie and you know it," I said, standing up. "My cabin was on my property. You had no right." Her pet cop, Mark Graves, stood up from his seat near the front. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to sit down. This is an official meeting." His voice had the hollow ring of fake authority, but it was enough. The room turned cold. It was one thing to whisper sympathies in the grocery store aisle. It was another thing to be publicly associated with the man the HOA president was accusing of being a criminal. I looked around the room, at the faces of people I'd known for years. The Rodriguez family wouldn't meet my eyes. Mrs. Gable looked down at her hands, her face pale. Even a few of the newer allies Tommy and I had made were now looking at me with suspicion. Had I jimmied a lock? Had I been sneaking around at night? Linda's poison was working. In the space of 2 minutes, she had isolated me completely. She had turned me from a victim into the villain. I felt a profound sense of defeat, a bone-deep weariness that my secret war couldn't touch. My grand plan to buy up the county felt a million miles away. In this room, in the hearts and minds of my neighbors, I had already lost. I sat down, the fight draining out of me. I just sat there and let her finish, let her spin her web of lies until the meeting was adjourned. I was the last one to leave, walking out of that clubhouse into the cold night air, feeling more alone than I had since the day Sarah died. I drove back to my small apartment in a daze. Maggie's words echoed in my head. "You're spending everything. For what? For this? To be humiliated and ostracized by the very people I was trying to help?" The weight of it all came crashing down on me. I sat in my rented kitchen, the stacks of deeds and plat maps, feeling like a monument to my own foolishness. I picked up the phone and called her. "You were right," I said as soon as she answered, my voice hoarse. "This is a mistake. I can't win." I told her what had happened, how Linda had twisted everything, how the room had turned on me. I expected an "I told you so." But Maggie was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm. "Dad, do you remember what Mom used to say about Mr. Henderson next door? The one who always complained about our dog barking?" I remembered. "The man was a miserable old goat." She said, "You don't argue with a man like that," Maggie continued. "You don't try to reason with him. You just build a better fence." There was a pause. "Your mother never ever backed down from a bully, Dad. Not once. She just found a smarter way to win. This isn't just about a cabin anymore. It's about not letting people like Linda have the last word, ever." We hung up a few minutes later, but her words stayed with me. Build a better fence. I looked over at the huge county map taped to my wall, covered in colored pins marking the parcels I'd acquired through Pine Ridge Holdings. All the pieces I had been buying, they weren't just random lots. They were fence posts, and I was just one post away from completing the fence. I had been playing checkers, trying to win over the neighbors one by one. It was time to play chess. The humiliation, the isolation, it wasn't a defeat. It was fuel. I grabbed the phone and called my lawyer. "There's one more parcel," I said, my voice low and clear. "It's the old abandoned logging access road that connects to the highway. It's the last piece. I don't care what it costs. Buy it. Today." The day of the HOA's annual meeting felt different. The air was thick with a tension you could almost taste. Linda had advertised it as a can't-miss event, a victory lap for her recent security enhancements. She'd even arranged for someone to stream it live on the community's private Facebook group, a move she clearly thought would solidify her power by broadcasting her dominance. I arrived early, along with Tommy. We took our usual seats in the back, but tonight, we weren't alone. My lawyer, a man who looked more like a librarian than a shark, sat quietly on one side of me. On the other was Dave, the gruff civil engineer. They were my aces, hidden in plain sight. The room filled up quickly, a mix of the fearful, the angry, and the blindly loyal. Linda started the meeting with a smug smile, ticking off her accomplishments for the year. Then she got to the main event. She projected a slide onto the wall with the words, "Community Protection Levy." It was a massive special assessment, a mandatory fee tacked onto everyone's dues. She claimed it was for new security cameras and to hire Mark Graves's firm to conduct nightly patrols. It was a sham. It was a war chest, funded by the very people she oppressed, designed to pay for the tools to oppress them further. And I knew, from the way she looked at me, that a huge chunk of that money was earmarked to fight me in court over the demolition fees and the lien on my land. All in favor of protecting our community's value and safety? She asked, her voice oozing with false concern as she held up her hand to call the vote. Before anyone could move, I stood up. "Point of order, Madam President," I said, my voice calm and clear, cutting through the silence. Every head in the room turned to me. Linda's smile tightened into a thin, angry line. "You are out of order, Jack. Sit down." "I don't think I am," I said, walking slowly toward the front of the room. "This levy you're proposing is to fund patrols and install cameras on what you call community property. I think we need to clarify what exactly constitutes community property." Mark Graves started to get up, but a quiet, "I wouldn't," from my lawyer stopped him dead in his tracks. Linda scoffed. "We have the bylaws, Jack. We have the deeds. It's all been settled for 50 years. Has it?" I asked. I unrolled a large, laminated copy of the original county plat map from 1978 and taped it to the wall next to her projection screen. I used a red marker to circle a small, faded section near the bottom. "This is the original easement agreement that grants the HOA authority over the lakefront access path. It was supposed to be signed by the developer and the county. The developer signed, but the county clerk never did." A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Linda's face went pale. She knew. Somewhere in her obsessive reading, she must have seen it and prayed no one else ever would. "That's a technicality," she stammered. "It's a clerical error. It doesn't mean anything." "You're right," I said, which seemed to surprise her. Ordinarily, it would just be a legal headache. But in this case, it doesn't matter at all anymore. Because that easement, valid or not, is now moot. I took out a second map, this one current, and taped it over the first. This map was mostly one color, a solid block of blue that surrounded the small island of the Lakeside Meadows subdivision. About 6 months ago, I began, my voice steady. A company called Pine Ridge Holdings started acquiring some land in this county. They bought the old Miller farm to the north. They bought the undeveloped woods to the west. They bought the abandoned logging road to the south. They also bought the strip of land all along the lakefront, including the ground directly underneath the path your contractors used to get to my cabin. I let that sink in. Linda was just staring, her mouth slightly open. "The land your community garden sits on? The patch of grass by the entrance where you want to install cameras? The shoreline you've been finding people for leaving their kayaks on? It seems that all now belongs to Pine Ridge Holdings." She finally found her voice, a high-pitched squeak of panic. "Who? I've never heard of them. You can't just—" "I can," I said, finally letting my eyes lock onto hers, "because I am the sole proprietor of Pine Ridge Holdings. I own it. All of it." The room exploded. It was a wave of sound, a collective gasp, followed by a roar of questions and shouts. Linda stood there, speechless, as the truth crashed down on her. The entire foundation of her power, the very land she stood on, was no longer hers to control. I held up my hand for silence, and as the owner of said land, I continued, speaking directly to her, "I am hereby informing the board that your community protection levy is dead, because you have no authority to place cameras or patrols on my property. Effective immediately, all fines related to landscaping, exterior decorations, and personal property on the lakefront are null and void. The lien on my land is illegal, as you were trespassing from the moment you set foot on that path. She started sputtering, grabbing for her binder of bylaws like it was a life raft. This is illegal. You can't do this! The board, Tommy Hayes' voice boomed from the back of the room. Sit down, Linda! It's over! Then Mrs. Gable stood up, her voice trembling but strong. You tried to take my house away from me because I feed the birds. You're a bully. The dam had broken. One by one, the people she had tormented for years stood up and found their voices. The room turned on her, a tidal wave of anger and resentment that had been building for a decade. The other board members looked at each other, their faces a mask of pure panic. They were rats on a sinking ship. A motion was made from the floor to remove Linda Crawford as president. It was seconded by about 30 people at once. The vote was a deafening roar of aye. It was over. Linda just stood there for a moment, her face a crumpled mess of shock and rage. Then, she snatched her papers, turned and stormed out of the clubhouse, slamming the door behind her. The room fell silent for a second, and then it erupted into applause. It wasn't just clapping, it was a celebration. It was the sound of freedom. A public humiliation like that doesn't just end when the door slams. Linda Crawford, stripped of her title and her power in one swift, brutal stroke, didn't just disappear. For a few days it was quiet. The remaining board members, terrified of a lawsuit from me and a rebellion from the residents, practically tripped over themselves to formally nullify the lien and every fine Linda had ever issued related to the lakefront. They were in damage control mode, offering apologies and promising transparency. But Linda wasn't built for quiet defeat. She was a cornered snake, and she had one last bit of venom left. A week after the meeting, my lawyer called. "You're not going to believe this," he said, and I could hear the bewildered chuckle in his voice. Linda Crawford filed a complaint. She claims that Pine Ridge Holdings is an illegal entity, and she submitted a corrected version of the 1978 easement agreement to the county, claiming the original was a forgery. Her corrected version, of course, has all the right signatures. I just laughed. A desperate, sloppy forgery was the last gasp of a dying monarchy. That, however, was just the paper trail she wanted us to follow. Her real move was dumber and far more direct. The very next evening, Tommy Hayes called me, his voice urgent. "Jack, you better get down to your property, now. Someone's messing around your land." I drove down the gravel road to my cleared lot, my headlights cutting through the darkness. In the middle of the empty space where my cabin used to stand, a single figure was illuminated. Linda. She had a gas can in one hand and a box of matches in the other. She was splashing gasoline onto the pile of demolished lumber, the last remnants of my cabin that the contractors had left pushed to the side. She was going to burn the evidence of her first crime right on top of my land, as if that would somehow erase what she'd done. She looked up, caught in the headlights like a wild animal, her face a mask of pure, unhinged fury. But she wasn't just caught by my headlights. Tucked away in the trees, a small, motion-activated trail camera that I'd set up weeks ago was silently recording the entire scene. It had already sent the video clip straight to my phone. Linda didn't get to light her match. The county sheriff, whom I'd called the second I hung up with Tommy, pulled in right behind me. This time, there was no talk of a civil matter. They had her on my property, with a gas can in her hand, on video. Trespassing, attempted arson, and, after my lawyer presented the county with her laughably fake documents, felony fraud, the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. It wasn't the dramatic courtroom takedown you see in movies. It was something better. It was the quiet, inevitable consequence of her own rotten actions. With Linda gone, a weight was lifted off the entire community. The first thing we did was hold a special meeting, not in the stuffy clubhouse, but outside, by the lake. We didn't elect a new president. We elected a new committee. Tommy was on it, and Mrs. Gable, and even Mr. Rodriguez. Their first order of business was a community-wide vote to rewrite the HOA bylaws from top to bottom. We didn't get rid of the HOA. You still need someone to manage the road maintenance and the septic systems. But we stripped it of its power to police people's lives. We put in term limits for board members. We capped the amount they could fine someone. We made it a requirement that any major decision had to be ratified by a majority of the homeowners, not just the board. We took the clipboard away and gave the power back to the people who actually lived there. It wasn't perfect, but it was fair. A few months later, the legal process with Linda resolved. She pleaded down, avoiding jail time for the arson charge, but she was hit with massive fines for the fraud and trespassing. More importantly, the court ordered her to pay full restitution for the value of my demolished cabin. The check that arrived in the mail wasn't enough to replace what was lost. It could never do that. But it was justice, printed in black and white. I never rebuilt the cabin. The memories were too sharp. Instead, I called another community meeting. I stood up and proposed that we use the restitution money to do something for everyone. We decided to build a new public dock on the lakefront, a sturdy, handsome thing made of cedar. Tommy and I led the construction, but half the neighborhood turned out to help. We worked on it every weekend that fall, sawing, hammering, and sharing stories. The sound of construction was no longer the sound of destruction. It was the sound of healing. When it was finished, we put up a small, simple bronze plaque at the entrance. It didn't have my name on it. It just said, "The Sarah Reynolds Memorial Dock, a place for peace." My life is quiet now, the way I always wanted it to be. I sold off most of the land I'd bought, parcel by parcel, to a state conservation trust, ensuring no developer could ever touch it. I kept my own lot, of course, and the stretch of shore where the new dock stands. I don't live there, but I visit often. I see kids fishing off the dock, couples watching the sunset, neighbors just sitting and talking. The cabin is gone. My rage is gone. But in their place, something better grew. A sense of peace. A community no longer governed by fear. Sometimes, late in the evening, I'll be helping Tommy fix a neighbor's fence or rewire a faulty outlet, and I'll look out over the water as the last light fades. I'll see the silhouette of the dock, and I know that what we built together is stronger than anything Linda Crawford could ever tear down.